Hello class and welcome to Lesson 7, Auditing, Testing, and Monitoring. For the learning objective, we're going to explain the importance of security audits, testing, and monitoring in an IT infrastructure. The key concepts, practices, and principles of security audits, ways to monitor systems, capturing and analyzing log data, assessing an organization's security compliance, and monitoring and testing security systems. Planning for security systems doesn't stop once you've deployed controls. If you really want to protect yourself from data breaches, you have to make sure you're ready for any type of attack. To do that, you evaluate your systems regularly. One crucial type of evaluation to avoid a data breach is a security audit. When you audit a computer system, you check to see how its operation has met your security goals. Simply put, when you audit a system, you see if things on the system work according to plan. Audits also often look at the current configuration of a system as a snapshot in time to verify that it complies with requirements. You can audit a system manually, or you can do it using automated computer software. Manual tests include interviewing your staff, performing vulnerability scans, reviewing application and operating system access controls, and analyzing physical access to the systems. With automated tests, the auditing software creates a report of any changes to important files and settings. These files and settings might relate to computing devices, operating systems, or application software. Computing devices can include personal computers, mobile devices, servers, network routers, and switches. Application software include any software that runs on any computing device that provides services to users. Of course, long before you can audit a system, you need to create the policies and procedures that establish the rules and requirements of the system. That is, before you can determine whether something has worked, you must first define how it's supposed to work. This is known as assessing your system. You evaluate all the components of your system and determine how each should work. This sets your baseline expectations. Once you have that, you can audit the system. You compare the system's performance to your baseline expectations to see whether things work as planned. The purpose of a security audit is to make sure your systems and security controls work as expected. When you review your systems, you should check for the following. Are security policies sound and appropriate for the business or activity? The purpose of information security is to support the mission of the business and to protect it from the risk it faces. With respect to security, one of the most visible risks is that of data breach. Your organization's policies and supporting documents define the risks that affect it. Supporting documents include your organization's procedures, standards, and baselines. When you conduct an audit, you are asking the question, are our policies understood and followed? The audit itself does not set new policies. Auditors might, however, make recommendations based on experience or knowledge of new regulations or other requirements. Next is, are there controls supporting your policies? Are the security controls aligned correctly with your organization's strategies and mission? Do the controls support your policies and culture? If you cannot justify a control by a policy, you should probably remove that control. Whenever a control is explained as for security, but with no other explanation, you should remove it. Security is not a profit center, and it should never exist for its own sake. It is a support department. Its purpose is to protect the organization's assets and revenue stream. And last is there effective implementation and upkeep of controls? As your organization evolves and as threats mature, it's important to make sure your controls still meet the risks you face today. If you can answer yes to these questions, you're in good shape. If you can't answer yes, don't worry, you'll develop these skills in this lesson. Security controls place limits on activities that might pose a risk to your organization. You must review security regularly to make sure your controls are current and effective. This security review includes the following activities. You monitor. This is where you review and measure all controls to capture actions and changes on the system. You audit. This is where you review the logs and overall environment to provide independent analysis of how well the security policy and controls work. Next, you improve. This includes proposals to improve the security program and controls in the audit results. This step applies to the recommended changes as accepted by management. And finally, you secure, where you ensure that new and existing controls work together to protect the intended levels of security. Although security controls protect your computers and networks, you should ensure that each one is necessary and is effective. Each control should protect your organization from a specific threat. A control without an identified threat is a layer of overhead that does not make your organization any more secure. Carefully ensure that all security controls you have in place address specific threats. It is fine to have multiple controls that address the same threat. Just ensure that each control does address at least one threat. Recall that risk is defined as the probability that a threat will be realized. You can calculate the expected loss by multiplying the risk probability by the asset cost. Identifying risks enables you to measure the validity of the control. When you use a control that costs more than the potential loss if a threat is realized, you may be wasting your organization's resources. One of the best ways to avoid wasting your organization's resources is to ensure that you follow the security review cycle. This figure shows the steps in the security review cycle and how they all fit together. Your first step toward putting the right security controls in place is to determine what actions are acceptable. Your organization's security policy should define acceptable and unacceptable actions. Your organization might create its own standards based on those developed or endorsed by security bodies. Communications and other actions permitted by a policy document are acceptable. Communications and other actions specifically banned in your security policy are unacceptable. Other communications or other actions may be unacceptable as well. Any action that may reveal confidential information, cause damage to a system's integrity, or make the system unavailable is also unacceptable, even if the policy does not specifically ban it. The proper permission levels for your organization depend on your organization's need and policies. It's essential to match your organization's required permission levels with its security structure. If you don't, you might lose a lot of data and your reputation could suffer. You could also find that users simply attempt to bypass your security controls if your security controls are tougher than is necessary. The most common permission levels are as follows. And you want to write this down. You have promiscuous, and these are covered in your book on page 219. But you have promiscuous, which is everything is allowed. This permission level is used by many home users, but make it easier for attackers to succeed. You have permissive. Anything not specifically prohibited is okay. This permission level is suitable for most public internet sites, some schools and libraries, and many training centers. You have prudent. A reasonable list of things is permitted. All others are prohibited. This permission level is suitable for most businesses. And you have paranoid. Very few things are permitted. All others are prohibited and carefully monitored. This permission level is suitable for secure facilities. Regardless of the levels of permission you use, it's important to inspect what you expect. This phrase applies to all aspects of auditing. It simply means that if you expect a computer to use prudent permission levels, look closely at its user rights and permissions. Make sure that the controls in place do what you expect them to do. User rights and permission reviews are an integral part of any security audit. If you have great security controls in place, but you give your users unlimited permissions, you really aren't keeping your systems very secure. Audits can be very large in scope and cover entire departments or business functions. On the other end of the spectrum, they can be narrow and address only one specific system of control. An audit provides management with an independent assessment of whether the best controls are in place and how well they work. This helps management understand and address the risks. For example, a high-level security policy audit is a review of your security policy to ensure it is up-to-date, relevant, communicated, and enforced. This type of audit also helps ensure that your policy reflects the culture of your organization. These audits may also determine whether users or customers accept the controls or whether they try to bypass the controls they view as unrealistic. In addition, this type of audit tests how well your infrastructure protects your application's data. It ensures that the application limits access to authorized users only and that it hides or encrypts data that unauthorized users should not see. You must also audit all your organization's firewalls, routers, gateways, wireless access points, and other network devices to ensure that they function as intended and that their configurations comply with your security policy. Finally, audits can test the technologies themselves. They can detect whether all your network computers and devices are working together according to your policy. They help ensure that your rules and configurations are up to date, documented, and subject to change control procedures. An audit gives you the opportunity to review your risk management program and to confirm that the program has correctly identified and reduced or otherwise addressed the risk to your organization. An audit checks whether controls are first appropriate. That means, is the level of security control suitable for the risk it addresses? Is it installed properly? That is the security control in the right place and working well? Or is it addressing their purpose? That is the security control effective in addressing the risk it was designed to address? The audit report that auditors create should recommend improvements or changes to the organization's processes, infrastructure, or other controls as needed. Audits are necessary because of potential liability, negligence, and mandatory regulatory compliance. Audits can expose problems and provide assurance of compliance. Many jurisdictions require audits by law. Laws and regulations require some companies that employ a certain number of employees or are in a particular industry to have both internal and external audits. Industries that must conduct these required audits include financial services organizations and any organization that handles personal medical records. Federal laws or vendor standards that require internal or external audits include the Sarbanes-Oxley Act or SOX, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act or HIPAA, and the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which is PCI DSS. The Personal Information Protection and Electronics Document Act is a Canadian law that protects how organizations collect, use, or disclose personal information in an e-commerce transaction. It also includes audit requirements. An audit might find that an organization lacks sufficiently trained and skilled staff. It might show that the company does not do enough to oversee security programs and manage assets. An audit might encourage an organization to provide better staff training. On the other hand, an audit might validate that an organization is meeting or exceeding its requirements. Many new regulations make management personally responsible for fraud or mismanagement of corporate assets. In the past, corporations were mostly accountable for these failings. Now individuals are responsible. It is in the organization's best interest to make sure every effort to be compliant with all necessary requirements to protect itself and its people. Customer confidence. Customers would generally do business only with organizations they trust. If customers know you consistently audit your systems for security, they may be willing to share their sensitive information with you. Many business-to-business service providers are using auditing standards to build customer confidence. The Auditing Standards Board of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants issued the Statement on Auditing Standards, number 70. We call this SAS 70. This was done in 1993. This was the first standard of its kind and provided audit guidance for many service organizations. SAS 70 was developed for organizations such as insurance and medical claims processors, telecommunications service providers, managed service providers, and credit card transactions processing companies. There were two types of SAS audits, Type 1 and Type 2. An SAS 70 Type 1 audit encompasses the service auditor's assessment of the service organization's description and implementation of controls to achieve the environmental control objectives. An SAS 70 Type 2 audit includes the information in a Type 1 audit, as well as the service auditor's assessment of whether or not the identified controls were implemented and operating effectively. Although SAS 70 was general in the scope, the standard did not address many of the emerging issues encountered in today's service organizations. For example, SAS 70 does not address supporting co-location or providing cloud-based services. SAS 70 was officially retired in June 2011. In 2011, the Statement of Standards for Attestation Engagements number 16, called as SSAE 16, superseded SAS 70. SSAE 16 expanded the scope of SAS 70 and is the predominant auditing and reporting standard for service organizations. SSAE 16 provides guidance to auditors when verifying controls and processes. It also requires that the reports include descriptions of the design and effectiveness of audited controls. These reports provide details that describe the organization's specific controls. For example, a company seeking to lease space in a data center might ask the data center to provide the results of an SSAE 16 or SAS 70 audit to get an independent assessment of the security controls in that data center. Reliance on the results of an SAS 70 and the new SSEA 16 has increased across many organizations. The AICPA has recognized the increased complexities of service organizations and created 3 different levels of audit reporting for service organizations. The Service Organization Control, or SOC, which you see on the slide, framework defines the scope and contents of 3 levels of audit reports. This figure lists the SOC reports and characteristics of each one. SOC 1, 2, and 3 reports are important tools for an organization's auditors. The SOC 1 report primarily focuses on internal controls over financial reporting. This type of report is often used to prepare financial statements for the user organization and to implement proper controls to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data generated by the financial reporting requirements. SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports both address primarily security-related controls. The security-related controls in these reports are critical to the success of today's technology service provider organizations. The primary difference between SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports is their audience. SOC2 reports are created for internal and other authorized stakeholders, and SOC3 reports are intended for public consumption. In planning the activities for an audit, the auditor first must define the objectives and determine which systems or business processes to review. The auditor should also define which areas of assurance to check. An auditor must also identify the personnel, both from his or her own team and from the organization being audited, who will participate in the audit. These people will gather and put together information to move the audit along. The auditor must be sure that everyone has the right skills, is prepared to contribute, and is available when they are needed. Some auditors include a review of previous audits to become familiar with past issues. Other auditors choose not to review previous audits to avoid being prejudiced by prior conclusions. You must define the boundaries of the review at the beginning of the project. It is critical to determine which areas the audit will review and which it will not. You must be sure that the areas not reviewed in the current audit will be subject to another audit, and you must set responsibilities for those areas. All systems and networks must have a clearly designated owner. In some cases, the scope of an audit extends beyond a single organization. If your organization outsources data or processing, you may need to include assets that exist outside your organization. You may need to audit components that you access through an interoperability agreement. Determining the scope of an audit may require interaction with external organizations. At this point, you need to decide whom to inform that an audit is underway. In many cases, if users know you're auditing them, they may start to follow rules they had previously ignored. If knowing about an audit changes user behavior, your audit would not be accurate. On the other hand, trying to perform an audit without telling staff makes the job more difficult by limiting access to critical information. You have to consider this trade-off on a case-by-case basis. This figure shows how the scope of an audit can span all 7 domains in the IT infrastructure. An auditor should take the time to properly plan an audit before conducting any audit activities. Planning is far more than just listing the files and documents to expect. In fact, auditors often do a substantial amount of work preparing for an audit. Here's what you can expect from an auditor throughout the planning and execution phase. First, they should survey the site. An auditor will want to understand the environment and the interconnections between systems before starting the audit activities. You should review documentation. An auditor will want to review system documentation and configurations both during planning and as part of the actual audit. Reviewing interoperability agreements requirements is necessary when audits include external partners. These documents specify agreed upon compliance requirements for outsourcing partners. You should review risk analysis output. An auditor will want to understand system criticality ratings that are a product of risk analysis studies. This helps rank systems into the appropriate order for mitigation in the reporting phase. You should review server and application logs. An auditor might ask to examine logs to look for changes to programs, permissions, and configurations. You should review incident logs. An auditor might ask to review security incident logs to get a feel for problem trends. And you might review results of penetration tests. When an organization conducts penetration tests, the tester prepares a report listing weaknesses that were found. The auditor needs to review this report and make sure that the audit addresses all items. A benchmark is the standard to which your system is compared to determine whether it is securely configured. One technique in an audit is to compare the current settings of a computer or device with a benchmark to help identify differences. In this section, you will find common ways to audit or review systems, business processes, or security controls. All of these examples are best practices. They often are used as guidelines for auditing a business or a business process. Your organization's management may have formally adopted one of the following examples that I'm about to give you. This can be especially true if your organization is subject to government regulation or legislation. If so, then the benchmark directs the main course of your audit. Otherwise, the auditor, with senior management's approval, decides how an audit is carried out. ISO 27002 is a best practices document that gives good guidelines for information security management. For an organization to claim compliance, it must perform an audit to verify that all provisions are satisfied. ISO 27002 is part of a growing suite of standards, the ISO 27000 series, that defines information security standards. NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF. NIST Cybersecurity Framework, first released in 2014, is a response to U.S. presidential executive order calling for increased cybersecurity. It focuses on critical infrastructure components, but it's applicable to many general systems. The roadmap provides a structured method to securing systems that can help auditors align business drivers and security requirements. NIDS also publishes a series of special publications that cover many aspects of information systems. For example, NIDS SP 800-37 is a standard that describes best practices, including auditing for U.S. government information systems. ITIL, which is an Information Technology Infrastructure Library, is a set of concepts and policies for managing IT infrastructure, development, and operations. ITIL is published in a series of books, each covering a separate IT management topic. ITIL gives a detailed description of a number of important IT practices, with comprehensive checklists, tasks, and procedures that any IT organization can tailor to its needs. Before you can analyze data, you need to identify and collect those data. There are many ways to collect data, including questionnaires. You can administer prepared questionnaires to both managers and users. Interviews. These are useful for gathering insight into operations for all parties. Interviews often prove to be valuable sources of information and recommendations. Observation. This refers to input used to differentiate between paper procedures and the way the job is really done. Checklists. These prepared documents help ensure that the information gathering process covers all areas. Reviewing documentation. This documentation assesses currency, adherence, and completeness. Reviewing configurations. This review involves assessing change control procedures and the appropriateness of controls, rules, and layout. Reviewing policy. This review involves assessing policy relevance, currency, and completeness, and performing security testing. This testing, vulnerability testing, and penetration testing, involves gathering technical information to determine whether vulnerabilities exist in the security components, networks, or applications. Part of the auditing process is to ensure that policy statements exist for all key areas. Auditors document any key areas that your policy does not address. After that, they check to see if all personnel are following policies, procedures, and standards. You will need a password standard, minimum characters and complexity, and a password procedure, guidelines for setting, changing, and resetting passwords to support your access control policy. Many organizations use their password policies as their system access policies. This is a dangerous mistake. You should develop a separate access control policy that says something similar to the following. Authorized users should be able to do only that which they are authorized to do. Unauthorized users should be prohibited from doing anything. Because passwords are so often the targets of attacks, the use of passwords is declining. Instead, many organizations are starting to use tokens, smart cards, or biometrics for authentication. Of course, a combination of these authentication types is even better, as you learned in an earlier lesson. As your IT environment changes, make sure your policies change too. You don't want all access control policies to dictate password strength when half your systems are using smart cards. A thorough audit ensures that your security policy is up to date and reflects your current environment. You should identify and remove any policies that are out of date. This slide shows several of the critical areas that you should include in a security audit. Things like antivirus software, system access policies, intrusion detection and event monitoring systems, system hardened policies, cryptographic controls, contingency planning, hardware and software maintenance, physical security, access control, change control processes for configuration management, and media protection. It is important to ensure that your security controls are effective, reliable, and functioning as you need it. Without monitoring and reviewing, you have no assurance that your information security program is effective or that personnel are exercising due diligence. When auditing an identity management system, you should focus on these key areas. Approval process. Who grants approval for access requests? Authentication mechanisms. What mechanisms are used for specific security requirements? Password policy and enforcement. Does the organization have an effective password policy and is it uniformly enforced? Monitoring. Does the organization have sufficient monitoring systems to detect unauthorized access and remote access systems? Are all systems properly secured with strong authentication? After audit activities are completed, the auditors still have work to do. Additional auditor tasks include exit interviews, data analysis, generation of the audit report, and presentation of findings to management. Let's start with looking at exit interviews. The auditor performs an exit interview with key personnel to alert them to major issues and recommendations that will come later in the audit report. This enables management to respond quickly and act on serious issues. Aside from these early alerts, auditors should not provide details before the final report. If they do, they might give a false view of the organization's security preparedness. Data analysis. Auditors commonly analyze data they collect away from the organizational site when such data removal is permitted. This enables the auditor to review everything learned and to present observations using a standard reporting format. Off-site analysis also enables auditors to remove themselves from the pressure often encountered while on site. Every organization wants to receive a positive audit report, and that desire sometimes translates into subtle pressure for an auditor. Performing data analysis at a different location from the audited organization can help encourage unbiased analysis. Generation of audit report. Audit reports generally contain at least 3 broad sections. First, you have findings. These are often listed by level of compliance to the standard benchmark. The comparison of audit findings with a stated policy or with industry best practices give a picture of where the organization must improve. Next, you have recommendations. Auditors recommend how to fix the risks they have found. They also tell how the staff might not be complying with a policy or process. In most reports, the recommendations address the most important issues first. Audit recommendations should include the following. Timeline for implementation. That's change recommendations. Change recommendations should not be open-ended. Each recommendation should have a suggested deadline. Level of risk. The audit should make clear the level of risk the organization faces from each finding. And management response. Auditors should give management an opportunity to respond to a draft copy of the audit report. They should then put that response in the final report. This response often clarifies issues and explains why controls were not used or why recommendations in the draft copy are not necessary. The response can also include action plans for fixing gaps in controls. Finally, follow-up. When necessary, auditors should schedule a follow-up audit to ensure the organization has carried out recommendations. Now, the final part is presentation of findings. When the auditors complete the audit report, they present their findings to the organization. Depending on your organization's structure and size, the findings presentation could be a formal meeting or it can involve simply delivering the report to a single person. Regardless of how you receive the audit findings, it's important that the audit organization examine the report and make the necessary changes. The findings might lead to changes based on regulatory requirements or available budget. The first goal of a security program is to set the security posture of an organization. The security policy defines the security posture, but the security program carries out the policy and actions. A security posture defines how an organization documents initial configurations, monitors activities, and remediates any detected issues. Monitoring is an important part of any security program. The primary purpose of monitoring is to detect abnormal behavior. After all, you can't remediate behavior that you can't detect. Security monitoring systems might be technical in nature, such as an intrusion detection system or IDS, or they might be administrative, for example, observing an employee or customer behavior on a closed-circuit television. When you detect abnormal or unacceptable behavior, the next step is to stop it. Stopping both overt and covert intrusive acts is both an art and a science. Overt acts are obvious and intentional. Covert acts are hidden and secret. Many attackers will attempt to avoid detection controls you have in place. In fact, just the presence of security monitoring controls can deter many attackers. On the other hand, it is possible to have too many monitoring devices. Security monitoring must be obvious enough to discourage security breaches, but adequately hidden so as not to be overbearing. Some tools and techniques for secure monitoring include the following. First, you have baselines. In order to recognize something as abnormal, you first must know what normal looks like. Seeing a report that says a system disk space is 80% full tells you nothing unless you know how much disk space was used yesterday or even last week. That is, a system that uses an additional 1% of disk every week and just tipped the alarm is very different from a system that was at 40% for the last month but suddenly doubled in usage. Baselines are essential in security monitoring. Next are alarms, alerts, and trends. Alarms and alerts are responses to security events that notify personnel of a possible security incident, much like a door open alert or a fire alarm. Reporting detected security events is necessary to maintain security information systems. The difference between an alarm and an alert depends on the asset state. Opening the door generates an alert if the alarm is not set. However, once an alarm is set, opening the door generates an alarm. This works like your home alarm system. During the day, opening the door may just cause the system to create a tone or alert. But at night, opening the door triggers an alarm. Be aware that employees will quickly ignore repeated false alarms. For example, if your neighbor's car alarm goes off repeatedly, you don't run to the window each time. That means employees will likely not respond to a real incident. For this reason, storing alerts and alarms make it possible to show how events occur over time. This type of analysis helps identify trends. Trend analysis helps auditors focus on more than just individual events. Next is closed-circuit TV. Properly using a closed-circuit TV involves monitoring and recording what the TV cameras see. You must ensure that the security officers monitoring the cameras are trained to watch for certain actions or behaviors. Your staff must also be trained in local law. Many jurisdictions prohibit profiling based on race or ethnicity. Last is systems that spot irregular behavior. Examples include IDSs and honeypots, that is, traps set to capture information about improper activity on a network. Just as there are many types of physical monitoring controls, there are also many ways to monitor computer and network system activity. You must select the controls that monitor the many aspects of your computing environment to detect malicious activity. Many tools exist to help you monitor your system's activities, both as they're occurring and after the fact. First is real-time monitoring. This provides information on what is happening as it happens. This type of monitoring is important in maintaining a proactive security posture. You can use the information from real-time monitoring controls to contain incidents and preserve your organization's business operations. A network intrusion detection system is one example of a real-time monitoring control. It monitors and captures network traffic as it travels throughout your network. Examples of this type of control include the following. You have host IDSs. A host intrusion detection system is excellent for noticing activity in a computer as the activity is happening. IDS rules help identify suspicious activity in near real time. You have system integrity monitoring. Systems such as Tripwire enable you to watch computer systems for unauthorized changes and report them to administrators in near real time. And also under real-time monitoring, you have data loss prevention. Data loss prevention systems are business rules to classify system information to prevent unauthorized end users from sharing it. Data that DLP protects are generally data that could put an organization at risk if they were disclosed. For example, DLP systems prevent users from using external storage services such as Dropbox for sensitive data. Non-real-time monitoring keeps historical records of activity. You can use this type of monitoring when it's not as critical to detect and respond to incidents immediately. Examples of this type of control include the following. You have application logging. All applications that access or modify sensitive data should have logs that record who used or changed the data and when. These logs support proof of compliance with privacy regulations, investigation of errors or problems with records, and tracking of transactions. And you have system logging. This type of logging provides records of who accessed the system and what actions they perform on the system. Next is a partial list of activities that you need to log. Host-based activity. This includes changes to systems, access requests, performance, and startups and shutdowns, and network devices. These include access, traffic type and patterns, malware, and performance. There's more on logging in your book on page 231 and 232. Let's look at the types of log information to capture. Your organization might need a large number of logs to record all the activity on your systems, networks, and applications. The four main types of logs that you need to keep to support security auditing include event logs. These are general operating system and application software events. Access logs. These include access requests to resources. Security logs include security-related events, and audit logs have defined events that provide additional input to audit activities. As shown in this figure, you should record all suspicious activities, errors, unauthorized access attempts, and access to sensitive information. As a result, you will not only track incidents, you also keep your users accountable for their activities. One specific class of monitoring controls can provide a very good layer of security. This class of controls monitors network and system activity to detect unusual or suspicious behavior. Some controls in this class can even respond to detected suspicious activity and possibly stop an attack in progress. Controls that monitor activity include intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, and firewalls. Layered defense requires multiple controls to prevent attacks. One of the most common layered defense mechanisms is to place an IDS behind a firewall to provide increased security. A network intrusion system monitors traffic that gets through the firewall to detect malicious activity. A host-based intrusion detection system, which we call a NIDS, which I'm going to cover later in this lesson, does the same for traffic aimed at a particular computer or device. Because the NIDS see a narrower view, you can tune it to detect very specific activities. Unlike the NIDS, the NIDS will also see traffic that originates inside the perimeter. This figure shows a network with a NIDS and a NIDS device. As shown in this figure, you can connect NIDS to a switch or to a hub. The IDS then captures all traffic on the switch and analyzes it to detect unauthorized activity. You can do this analysis in several ways depending on the type of engine in the IDS. You connect the IDS to a management console that lets the administrator monitor and manage it. Ideally, the IDS will not be detectable from the network. That means attackers will not be able to determine where the IDS is positioned on the network. The administration port on the IDS is not accessible from the network, which prevents an attacker from alerting the configuration of the IDS. Monitoring and detection devices must examine and analyze activity to know when to raise an alarm or an alert. Devices can use several methods to analyze traffic and activity. Some methods compare network packets or addresses to rules, whereas others look at the frequency and the type of attack. These two methods are called pattern or signature-based and anomaly or statistical-based IDSs. Let's start with pattern or signature-based IDSs. Using what's known as rule-based detection, they rely on pattern matching and stateful matching to compare current traffic with activity patterns, or what we call signatures, of known network attacks. Pattern matching systems scan packets to see whether specific byte sequences known as signatures match the signature of known attacks. Often the patterns are related to a certain service and port, or source or destination. To avoid this type of control and attempt to escape detection, many attackers change their attacks. You must frequently update your signature files to ensure that you can detect the latest known attacks. Stateful matching improves on simple pattern matching. It looks for specific sequences appearing across several packets in a traffic stream rather than just an individual packet. Although more detailed than pattern matching, stateful matching can still produce false positives. Like pattern matching, stateful matching can detect only known attacks. It needs frequent signature updates. Anomaly-based IDSs, sometimes called profile-based systems, compare current activity with stored profiles of normal expected activity. These are only as accurate as the accuracy of your definition of normal activity. Once you define normal system operation, the IDS compares current activity to what you consider normal activity. Anything the IDS considers abnormal is a candidate for analysis and response. The more common methods of detecting anomalies include the following. You have statistical-based methods. These develop baselines of normal traffic and network activity. The device creates an alert when it identifies a deviation. These can match unknown attacks, but false positives often happen because identifying normal activity is hard. It can be traffic-based methods. These signal an alert when they identify any unacceptable deviation from expected behavior based on traffic. They can also detect unknown attacks and floods. Last is protocol patterns. Another way to identify attacks without a signature is to look for deviations from protocols. Protocol standards are provided by requests for comments, or RFCs, and these are from memorandums published by the Internet Engineering Task Force. You can get more information on RFCs at www.ietf.org/rfcs.html. This type of detection works for well-defined protocols, but may cause false positives for protocols that are not well-defined. HIDS technology adds to your entire system's protection by keeping watch over sensitive processes inside a computer, also called a host. HIDS systems generally have the following qualities. They are usually software processes or services designed to run on server computers. They intercept and examine system calls or specific processes, like database and web service, for example, for patterns or behaviors that should not normally be allowed. HIDS daemons can take a predefined action such as stopping or reporting the infraction. HIDS also have a different point of view than NIDS. A HIDS can detect inappropriate traffic that originates inside the network. It can also recognize an anomaly that is specific to a particular machine or user. For example, a single user on a high-volume mail server might originate 10 times the normal number of messages for a user in any day or hour. The HIDS will notice and issue an alert, but a NIDS may not notice a reportable event. To the NIDS, it just looks like increased network traffic. The best defense is to have multiple layers of controls in place. This increases the chances that you'll protect your systems from more attacks than just a single control. This figure shows how network devices work in multiple layers to try to prevent an attack on an internal protected network. The router detects and filters out some traffic, and the firewall detects and stops unwanted traffic. A NIDS is an important component in any multi-layered defense strategy. This figure shows how a NIDS can monitor outside attacks as well as insider misuse. A NIDS outside the network gives some idea of the types of attacks faced by the firewall. The internal NIDS detects the types of attacks that may get by the firewall. You can also install this device on an IPS. That way, the device not only can detect a potential attack, it can also change its rules to filter traffic to stop the attack. These devices also work well with HIDS devices. While the NIDS help protect your system from malicious network traffic, the HIDS will see the types of activity being attempted on the host itself. Some servers or hosts must be open to the internet. Web servers are examples of such hosts. You want any user to be able to access your web server, but you don't want everyone to be able to get to your internal network. A simple solution is to isolate the host connected to the internet from the rest of your network. Host isolation isolates one or more host computers from your internal networks and creates a demilitarized zone, or DMZ. This figure shows a DMZ with two isolated hosts. A DMZ is a physical or logical subnetwork that contains and exposes an organization's external services to a larger untrusted network, usually the internet. Outside traffic from the untrusted internet is allowed only into the DMZ, where it can get to certain company services. The web applications in the DMZ then access the trusted internal network, but prevents the outside user from getting directly into the internal network. No computer is completely secure. In fact, very few operating systems or application software packages are secure when you install them. It is important that security administrators go through a process called hardening to change hardware and software configurations. To make computers and devices as secure as possible, a computer or device with a hardened configuration is one in which you have carried out the following minimal actions: turned off or disabled unnecessary services and protected the ones that are still running. Secure management interfaces and applications. Protect passwords through aggressive password policies. Disable unnecessary user accounts. Applied the latest software patches available and secured all computers and devices from any unauthorized modification. In addition to hardening systems, it is important to harden your network as well. There are many opportunities to harden networks, but just a few steps go a long way towards making your networks and your network devices more secure. These steps include disabling unused network interfaces, disabling unused application service ports, using MAC filtering to limit device access, and implementing 802.1x port-based network access control. Harden all systems before implementing them. Failure to harden a system before you put it into production almost certainly will result in its compromise. Securing a closed environment is difficult. Your main goal as a security professional is to protect your organization's sensitive data from attackers. As hard as it is to secure a closed system, the job becomes far more difficult when your network connects to the internet. Just by connecting to the internet, you roll out a red carpet for attackers. Your job is to deploy strategies to control access to your systems. Keep in mind that completely securing your system is impossible. Although there are many risks associated with information security, two of the most common risks are attackers who come in from outside with unauthorized access, malicious code, trojans, and malware, and sensitive information leaking from inside the organization to unauthorized people who can damage your organization. How can you prevent the leakage of sensitive information from your organization? There is no fail-safe method, but monitoring is key. Of course, you can't watch every IP packet on your system. Even if you could train humans to do this mind-numbing, boring work, you wouldn't be able to put enough people on it to keep it. Instead, you must monitor your traffic with an intrusion detection system, or IDS. The premise behind an IDS is that you identify abnormal traffic for further investigation. Intrusion detection systems, or IPSs, go a step beyond IDSs by actively blocking malicious traffic. An IDS alerts you to potentially unauthorized activity. An IPS blocks it. Of course, before you can use an IDS or an IPS, you must create a baseline definition of normal traffic. In addition to monitoring your system, you must test it. The main purpose of any security test is to identify uncorrected vulnerabilities on a system. A system might have been secure at one time, but the addition of a new service or application might have made the system vulnerable. The point of testing is to discover new vulnerabilities so you can address them. This figure shows the main goals of security testing. The frequency of your testing depends on such factors as the volatility, which is the rate of changes of the system, and the sensitivity or criticality of the system. Also, policy and regulation often mandate tests. A few of the most common test schedule trigger points are as follows. During the security certification phase you want to test, After major system changes, where you have new technology upgrades and application changes you want to test, when you have new threats, during system audits, periodically depending on the nature of the system, and once a year on critical systems. If none of the other items on this list trigger a test, you should do one at least once a year anyway. Some companies might choose shorter or longer testing intervals depending on the risk analysis. No perfect solution exists when it comes to testing, and not every security professional will follow the same path. This figure shows a roadmap for security testing. As shown in this figure, security testing consists of a few common activities that give you a complete view of your system's security. The most common activities include the following. First, you have reconnaissance. This activity involves reviewing the system to learn as much as possible about the organization, its systems, and its networks. Public resources for the job, such as WHOIS and DIG, are invisible to network administrators, and this is a problem when they are used by attackers instead of penetration testers. Next is network mapping. This phase uses tools to determine the layout and services running on the organization's systems and networks. Next is vulnerability testing. Vulnerability testing involves finding all the weaknesses in a system and determining which places may be attack points. Next is penetration testing. In this phase, you try to exploit a weakness in the system and prove that an attacker could successfully penetrate it. And finally is mitigation activities. Any actions intended to reduce or address vulnerabilities found in either penetration tests or vulnerability tests. Before you run your testing procedures, it's important that you establish your testing goals. Security testing is most concerned with evaluating how well your controls address vulnerabilities. First, identify vulnerabilities and rank them according to how critical they are to your systems. Next, document a point in time or snapshot test for comparison to other time periods. You want to ensure that your security controls are working properly regardless of the time of day or volume of activity. Then prepare for an auditor review. This enables your IT staff to tune and test their procedures using vulnerability analysis in preparation for real audits. Finally, find the gaps in your security. This step enables covert testers, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, to determine the likelihood of system compromise and intrusion detection. Let's drop down and look at reconnaissance methods. Reconnaissance is the first and most basic of many tests. In the reconnaissance phase, you gather information through techniques such as social engineering or by researching the organization's website. Attackers use as many types of reconnaissance as possible to gather information about an organization. You should understand what these attackers are doing and then limit their ability to gather information about you. Social engineering is a fancy phrase for lying. It involves tricking someone into sharing confidential information or gaining access to sensitive systems. In many cases, the attacker never comes face to face with the victim. Instead, the attacker might phone an employee and pose as a system administrator. All too often, attackers trick employees into sharing sensitive information. After all, employees think, what's wrong with giving your password to an administrator? You should train your users to recognize social engineering attacks. Another reconnaissance tool is the WHOIS service. This service provides information such as names and phone numbers of administrators that can help attackers. A zone transfer is a unique query of a DNS server that asks it for contents of its zone. The zone is the domain that the server manages. Administrators often use this tool to synchronize DNS servers within the same organization. If you allow zone transfers without restriction, attackers can use this information to try to figure out the names and types of servers that reside both inside and outside your network. The best defense from this type of information leakage is to lock down your DNS server. Network mapping is an extended type of reconnaissance. Network mapping discovers details about a network, including its host and host addresses, as well as available services. This might enable attackers to identify certain types of systems, applications, services, and configurations. This figure shows some of the information network mapping may provide. An attacker can use Internet Control Message Protocol, or ICMP, also known as ping, packets to discover a network layout. This gives the attacker an advantage in setting up an attack. As shown in this figure, blocking ping packets, as seen with the Tony router on the bottom, can prevent the attacker from learning about the network. Of course, this also prevents the administrator from being able to use this valuable tool for network troubleshooting. This figure shows how an attacker can discover the services available on a target host using TCP SYN Scans. The attacker sends packets to common ports and can determine from the response whether the host accepts these services. Attackers need to know what operating system a potential system is running. the approach to attacking a system differs based on the target operating system. With operating system fingerprinting, an attacker uses port mapping to learn which operating system and versions are running on a computer. This can also help an attacker discover computers that might be vulnerable because they don't have patches or may have known exploits. This figure shows how operating system fingerprinting can provide attackers with valuable information. You can carry out security testing, which can involve both internal and external staff overtly or covertly. The personnel and methods you use might depend on regulations or on the skill level of internal staff. This slide shows the various types of testers. Regardless of who does the testing, you must consider the potential impacts of testing sensitivities. You must be aware of the potential for harm, and you must be aware of the time of day and the day of week of the attack. Let's take a look at the testing methods. First, you have a black box testing. Black box testing uses test methods that aren't based directly or on knowledge of a program's architecture or design. The term implies that either the tester does not have the source code or the details of the source code are not relevant to what is being tested. Put another way, black box testing focuses on the externally visible behavior of the software. For example, it may be based on requirements protocol specification, APIs, or even attempted attacks. In contrast, white box testing is based on knowledge of the application's design and source code. In fact, white box tests are generally derived from source code. For example, these tests might target specific constructs found in the source code or try to achieve a certain level of code coverage. And finally, you have gray box testing. It lies somewhere between black box testing and white box testing. It uses limited knowledge of the program's internals. In principle, this might mean the tester knows about some parts of the source code and not others. In practice, it usually just means that the tester has access to design documents that are more detailed than specifications or requirements. For example, the test might be based on an architectural diagram or a state-based model of the program's behavior. Here's covert versus overt testing. Before you start the testing process, consider these points. First, choose the right tool. Choosing tools that are best for testing your software depends on what is to be tested and how the test plans indicate the test should be carried out. Keep in mind that tool functions often overlap. Tools make mistakes. You should view preliminary results with skepticism. Watch for false positives or false negatives. Tool results can vary because detection methods often are not consistent. Protect your systems. Carrying out tests at the wrong time or in the wrong way can damage systems. Take care to protect your systems. And finally, tests should be as real as possible. Tests should run against production networks and systems to the degree that is possible without impairing system operations. So in this lesson, you learned about security auditing. You learned how auditing is used to help you create safer systems. You explored why you need these audits and how they create a culture of responsibility and accountability. You discover how to define your auditing plan, including its scope and how it works to develop secure systems. You learn about auditing benchmarks and how they help to create the basis for your auditing plan. You also learn about data collection methods, including how they help you gather information you need to perform a quality audit. You also study post-audit activities and how they help you complete the process. You explored log collection and analysis, including how they help you monitor your systems. You also learn about log management. You develop an understanding of the types of log information you should capture and the tools that can help you capture it effectively. Finally, you explore monitoring and testing security systems. I'll see you in Lesson 8.